Hi patrons, I'm Gertie and welcome to another month of content on Patreon. I'm so excited to be bringing you the Gardner top this month. This fabulous top was named for Ava Gardner because we found this wonderful photo of her wearing this beautiful lace top, and we're so inspired by it that we created this lace yoke top for you. So what's really special about this top, I think, is that I've always really loved those sheer lacy blouses you can find on Etsy and in vintage shops. But if you're anything like me, you think, how am I going to wear this in my day-to-day life? You know, I'm just gonna wear a bustier under it. It's not exactly work friendly, right? So I wanted to design something that would allow you to wear your everyday undergarments underneath it, but still have this beautiful sheer effect at the yoke. So the other cool thing about this top is that it uses two very different fabrics. We have a stable knit in the body of the top and on the collar, just like the Hepburn top, so like a ponte or something like that is going to be great. And then in the yoke, we use a sheer fabric, like a rigid lace. So it doesn't need to be stretched. It's actually better if it's a rigid, non-stretch lace or other sheer. And we'll talk a little bit more about other fabrics you can use a couple chapters later. So I think this is just a great solution. I mean, you guys know I love my international male tops like we did with the Barbie top, and then I wear a bustier underneath it. But this is great because you can just wear your regular everyday bra like I am today. You can just wear a flesh-toned strap like this, and it's great for work, any other place you may want to wear in your everyday life. So this month's merit badge is collars. So as always, we're going to go on an educational journey together, and we're going to talk about your best practices for getting a really crisp collar, what kind of interfacing to use, the kind of grading and trimming you're going to want to do. Understitching is so important. And also today, I'm so excited that I'm going to show you a clean finish method with this collar. You can see there's no facing, there's no bias binding or anything underneath there. It's like magic, so I can't wait to show you that little trick. And we're gonna go through all the steps of sewing this top, how to sew the yoke, how to do the keyhole opening at the back, the hook and eye closure. And as you can see, this is just a great versatile top. It looks so good with Lucille from a couple months ago. And your Stanwick skirts, it's just a great mix and match separate. So let's go ahead and get started talking about the pattern. Okay, let's take a look at the pattern pieces together. So these are obviously scaled down pieces so that we can look at them in little dollhouse size. So the great thing about this pattern, minimal pattern pieces, there are only 6 pieces that you're going to need to cut for yourself. There are different cup size groupings. So I just wanted to call to your attention the way we did the groupings for this pattern. It's exactly the same as we did for the Hepburn top if you've sewn that one. So we have the A through C cup here, the D through F cups, and then the G and H cups sized together. So find your cup size, and then the difference you're going to see between these is the French dart and the shape of it. So as you can see, the dart gets bigger for each cup size, right? What's unusual about this dart, the French dart, is that on the A through C, you've just got this little triangle to cut out on the side. And then when you get to the D to the F, there's more of a cutout. And then when you get to the G through the H, you actually need to cut out that wedge when you're cutting out your fabric. So just be aware of that. Now choose your cup size that you're going to use. I'm going to be using the D through F cup today. So you're going to need piece 1 for your front. This is cut on the fold in your ponte or stable knit. Then you have your top back, also cut on the fold in your ponte. And the other pieces that you're going to cut in the stable knit are the 2 collar pieces. Now this pattern has an under collar and an upper collar. And because we're focusing on a collar educational journey today. I did want to say that it can really help in your pattern if your upper collar is slightly larger all the way around than your under collar. And we drafted it that way for you. So the reason for that is so that the seam line of the collar really rolls around to the bottom underside of the collar, and you don't see the seam line right on the edge, which can look not so attractive. Okay, so that's why you have two separate pieces for your collars. You are going to cut the upper collar in interfacing as well, but you don't need to do that for your under collar. No interfacing on the under collar. And then we also have your yoke pieces. So there's your front yoke, and you can see how that's going to get sewn together with your top front. And your back yoke gets sewn together with the top back, like that. Now, these two pieces get cut in your sheer fabric or your lace. Number 3, the front yoke is cut on the fold. That's what that arrow is for. Number 4, the back yoke, is not cut on the fold. You do need to cut 2, but there is a seam at center back where you create that keyhole opening. So just keep that in mind. And I know you all have really enjoyed when I've talked about possible fitting alterations in this chapter. So one thing I did want to mention that you could do on this top is you might need to adjust the height of the dart. The dart should be pointing towards the fullest part of your bust or your nipple. So if your apex or the fullest point is lower than where the dart is pointing, you can always lower this on your own. So you can take the point down, say you need to lower it 1 inch, just lower it right there, and then use a ruler for this, don't do what I'm doing, but you would just redraw your dart legs to meet that new point. Okay, so don't feel like you're not allowed to change the position of the dart. You can definitely do that. All right, and the other thing I wanted to mention about the fit is that this is a cut-on sleeve, and it just naturally has some drape to it. So I know a lot of people freak out about this. You're gonna see some drape around your underarm, and that's just part of the look of this top, and it was very common and fashionable in the mid-century. So I love how it looks, and I just wanna say, don't freak out about that little fitting thing if you see just a little bit of draping under your arm or above the bust. All right, so next we are going to talk about fabrics and supplies. All right, let's talk about fabric. I feel like this is a really fun project to choose your fabric for because, as I mentioned in the intro, you get to choose 2 very different types of fabric. And the most fun part is choosing your sheer or lace that you're going to use for the yoke. So as I said, it should be a rigid, non-stretch lace. So you're looking for something like this that doesn't stretch, doesn't have any lycra in it. I love cotton and nylon blend laces, and we'll give you some links to some of those in the instructions, as always. B&J has a nice selection of cotton laces. So this one's really beautiful. And this one, worth mentioning, is gonna give you more coverage, right, than something that's more sheer or doesn't have these like big motifs on the lace would give you. So just to keep in mind, the level of coverage that you want too. The lace I'm going to be using today, this is another cotton nylon blend lace from B&J, really cute with these little roses. And same thing here, you get a little more coverage with these big floral motifs. Now, if you're not so into lace, there are some other really fun options. How about a dotted tulle? This is also sometimes called an aspirin dot, which I've always thought was really funny because these look like little aspirins. So tulle does have a bit of what's called mechanical stretch in it. So just the little net diamonds will stretch a little bit, but it doesn't have lycra blended in. And this direction has less stretch. Okay, so this is a really cute little red polka dot tulle. B&J also has some velvet flocked polka dot tulles, which are really fun. This is called a point d'esprit, which is another little dotted tulle, very cute in this white. And then you'll see in our photos, I did one sample in this very fabulous fishnet. You guys know I love fishnet for my international male fantasy. This one is really cool. It has different rhinestones already applied to it, some jet rhinestones and peach ones, and your AB rhinestones on there too. Now, this kind of thing, you can go crazy finding beaded and rhinestone fabrics. Just keep in mind, you will need to remove any beads or rhinestones from the seam allowances after you cut the pieces out. So poor Melisha worked on this one, and she had to remove these rhinestones with some little jewelry pliers. So just keep that in mind that you'll need to do that, but it is worth the effect, if I do say so myself. All right, so that is your yoke. For the rest of the top, you are going to want a Ponte. I mean, I really feel like Ponte knit is the go-to for this top, right? So Pontes are like a stable knit. They're not, you know, think of what we've used for Barbie or Skipper. That's a stretchier jersey. These are more stable. They don't stretch that much. So you're looking for 10 to 25% stretch on your stable knit. So remember, the way you do that is you can grab 2 to 4 inches of your knit and see how much it stretches. See, this doesn't stretch that much at all. And there's no way I'm gonna be able to do the math in my head right now, but trust me, that's within our range. So just keep in mind that you want it to be 10 to 25% stretch. Okay, other supplies. You're also going to need interfacing, a fusible interfacing. So I'll give you some recommendations in the instructions for that, but we have been using tricot knit for all of our tops for the collar, for the upper collar. You are also going to want your regular all-purpose polyester thread for this. We're using Gutermann. I also really like Mettler. Very important to have a stretch or jersey ballpoint needle for your machine to sew the Ponte with. Otherwise, you could get some skipped stitches, all right? So make sure you have the correct kind of needle. And then you're also going to want a hook and eye to close the keyhole in the back. All right, and then just your usual sewing supplies, your pins, your shears, your ruler, something to mark your dart with, etc. All right, so let's get started with first sewing steps. Okay, everyone, let's get sewing. So as a side note, you may notice my new space here. I'm shooting for the first time from our studio, not from my house. So very exciting. However, there is a lot of sound going around us today, including some stomping upstairs. So I apologize in advance if you hear any ambient noise, and we will work to reduce that in the future. But for now, let's talk about stay stitching. So I know you all have done stay stitching before, but just a few things on the Gardner top that I want to mention. So you're going to be doing your stay stitching on the V shape of the top front and top back. Okay, and as always, the stay stitching is just to stabilize an area that may otherwise stretch out, like this very biasy angle of the yoke seam. Okay, so one thing that has really helped me with this top is to mark in my center front and center back V points with a disappearing ink marker and a ruler so that I know exactly where my stay stitching should be meeting. And on that note, if you've seen me do stay stitching on a video before, you know that I like to stay stitch from each shoulder into center front or center back. So stay stitch directionally towards the center front / center back to avoid distorting the grain by sewing from one end to the other. Okay. The other thing is I always do my stay stitching with a seam allowance of right between 1/2 inch and 5/8 of an inch. I just find, the center point between those two marks on my throat plate of my sewing machine. And then that ensures that I'm as close as possible to the 5/8 of an inch seam line without being in the body of the garment. Okay, so those are my tips for stay stitching. You're gonna do that on the top front and the top back. So those are pieces 1 and 2. And now we're going to move on to our French darts. Very exciting. So let me grab my top front. And of course you will want to have marked in your dart stitching lines, so transfer them from the pattern to the wrong side of your fabric. And just looking at this dart, I'm sure you can see it has a very curved shape to it. So this is what gives you that really lovely diagonal, shapely French dart. So what we're going to do is, just as per usual, fold our dart right sides together in half lengthwise. But I really want you to take your time marking this dart because of that curve. I'm sorry, take your time pinning the dart. Because of this curve, it can be really hard to pin your dart accurately. So what I want you to do is take a pin and pierce through the fabric, through the marked line, and make sure that it's matching up to the line on the underside. And mine isn't, so I need to just roll the fabric to make sure that the dart line is matching up on the underside. And it's just a little bit trickier with this curved dart. I find it takes a little bit more time and a few more tries than I normally take with a dart. So just keep that in mind and just take your time with this part. Ooh, yeah, see how far off I was? So I have to like maneuver the fabric, just kind of like roll it between your fingertips until those dart lines are right on top of each other from top to bottom. And now as we're getting closer to the side seam edge of the fabric, I do want to just show you how the edge of the fabric is going to look. This is where you're going to start stitching, right? So it's kind of a weird shape because we have this excess seam allowance right here, but don't worry about these weird little shapes over here. Worry about where you're going to start stitching, which is at the 5/8 of an inch seam line, and see how those pieces match up perfectly right there. That's what you want to see. All right, so let's start stitching this. I am using a regular stitch length, so about 2.5 millimeters, starting at that little V point that I just called out to you. And I'm using a straight stitch, okay? We are gonna be using some zigzag stitches on this top because we're using a knit, but for the darts, I always like to use a straight stitch. So I'm just following my marked line on my dart, taking my pins out. Wait as long as possible to take those pins out so that your fabric doesn't roll back to where it wanted to be in the first place before you took all that time pinning it. And stitch all the way to the end, and just take your time at the point here. And as I always say, I like to do just a few stitches just right on the very fold here so that we get a nice, elegant dart point. All right, and so don't backstitch at the point. Now I'm going to give myself a few inches to tie off here. I'm gonna tie off that dart and trim it close. Okay, we are going to press our dart open. And I did just want to mention that I had to change my needle. I started with a jersey needle and I noticed that I was getting some skipped stitches. And then I switched to a stretch needle and it totally resolved the problem, which to me just means I always like to keep a variety of needles on hands because some fabrics, especially with Lycra blended in, can be a little bit finicky. So if one doesn't work, just give another a try and you should find something that works. Okay, so I'm going to trim open this dart. See how it has, it's kind of like started because of that little opening on the pattern. It's kind of started, but you just want to continue cutting the dart open so that we can then press it open. So just trim as far up as you can, or slash, as we say. Slash the dart open as far as you can, and then we'll be able to press it open. And I'm working on a ham here so that I have a curved surface. So I like to press it open, use a little bit of steam there. And then when you get to the point of the dart, find a really curvy part of your ham so that it lays completely flat.
And then I like to press the point just slightly down, right? So you're pressing open, open, open where it's slashed, and then the point you want to just be pressed down. And then you can just check your dart from the right side, make sure that it looks nice and smooth. I'm gonna go back and just get a little bit of a crisper press at the very edge, but other than that, I feel good about it. All right, so I'm going to sew my other dart, repeat all those steps, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about sewing the yoke. All right, now that you have pressed your darts, we are ready to start working on our yoke, which is very exciting. So I've laid out my lace yoke here and my top, which is stay stitched to the center front point. And this is where, again, I find it really helpful to mark in the exact center front point by marking in my seam allowances. All right, so one thing I just want to say about this process is that you can see how these pieces are going to go together beautifully once they're attached. But the weird thing about sewing these two opposing triangular shapes is that when we put this right sides together, you can see how opposing they are. It becomes a little bit tricky to sew these together. So I'm just going to give you a few little tricks to be able to do this. The most important one is clipping your seam allowance to the center front point, okay? And again, that's why I like to mark this in, and also why you want to have your stay stitching going exactly to the center front V point so that you know exactly where to clip. You're going to want to clip as close to your stitching as possible without clipping through it, obviously. Okay, so now we have this nice clipped V point, so we'll be able to turn this the same way as the yoke will be facing. All right, does that make sense? Okay, so take your yoke and put it right sides together with your top. And I personally like to sew from the clip side. Hi, Hattie. Miss Hattie is tip-tapping over to say hi to you all. And so I like to put a pin right at this clipped point right here. Okay, and then we can match each side of the yoke. And you will have notches to match here, so match those notches. And just pin along each side here. And this is just one of those steps where you really want to take your time pinning. All right, so pinning those layers together. What are you doing, Hattie? I think Hattie's missing the limelight today. All right, so same thing on the other side. You get the idea. I'm going to keep pinning here. But the most important point is right here, because that's where we're going to pivot. I mean, it's not that hard. You can do it. Just know that it's going to take a little maneuvering right at that point. Okay, now that we are, oh, she's, Hattie is sleeping in a pile of fabric under the ironing board. It's very cute. We might have to get a photo for Instagram later. Okay, so we're gonna take this over to the sewing machine. And again, I really like to stitch from the knit side. Stitch at 5/8 of an inch, use your straight stitch. Back stitch at this end. Now sewing to the V point is super simple, right? Nice straight line here. Okay, start to exercise some caution when you get close to the V point. Just take it nice and slow. Now I'm gonna stitch to my pin and stop with my needle down at that pivot point, okay? Needle down, very important. Now I'm going to raise my presser foot, and now I can kind of rearrange everything so that all that excess fabric is now folded away from where I'm going to be stitching. Now just watch out for this. See how my lace is kind of bunching on the bottom here. And now make sure you're nice and smooth under your presser foot. You don't have any folds on this side. If you do, just rearrange them out of the way. And now we can start stitching again on the other side. So just keep going to the raw edge. Okay, so this is kind of the moment of truth. You are going to, oh, look how pretty these colors look together. So you're going to just check your V point. You may get a pucker, it happens. If you do, just take your stitching out in that area, go back and try again, okay? You can just redo the V point. Now, what we're going to do next is, these seam allowances are going to be stitched down, right? We obviously don't want to see these seam allowances through your beautiful lace yoke. So they are going to be pressed down. So what you want to do is a little bit of grading here. Okay, so let's grade these seam allowances. On this top, because this seam allowance is going to be pressed down and edge stitched on the Ponte side, we are going to make sure that the lace is the shorter seam allowance, right? And the reason for that is that whatever seam allowance is going to be closer to the visible side of the garment, that should be the longer one, okay? Because this longer seam allowance needs to shield that smaller seam allowance to keep from seeing a ridge on the right side. So that's the long-winded reason for that. But just know that the lace should be the shorter one. The garment itself should be the longer seam allowance. All right, so I'm gonna keep trimming my seam allowances, and then we'll come back to do some edge stitching. Okay, so after you do your grading, you're going to want to press your seam allowance towards the Ponte side of the seam. So we're gonna press it down like that. Be careful with lace, some of them can melt. Mine is cotton, so should be fine. But this is a great place to use a press cloth. And just make sure you get that point pressed down nicely. Okay, we're going to go into edge stitching now. And you guys know I love this number 10 edge stitching foot for my Bernina. So I'm gonna use that, but you can live dangerously and just use your regular presser foot, or also a blind hem foot would work as well, just so you have some center mark there. is what you're looking for. So a blind hem foot will have the same blade going down the center of the foot. That's really helpful. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're on a straight stitch. We are going to edge stitch from the right side of the garment. I'm going to position my needle to the left. See how I'm positioning the blade of this foot so it's just aligned with this seam line? I'm positioning the needle as far to the left as it will go, which is about 1/8 of an inch for edge stitching. And I'm going to start stitching here. And the great thing about this foot is I don't have to look at where I'm stitching. I just have to make sure that the blade of this foot is aligned with the seam line. And just use your right hand to make sure that your seam allowances stay pressed where they're supposed to be. And hopefully you can see what we're getting here is a really nice edge stitch along the seam line that will keep those seam allowances where we want them to be so they're not showing through your lace. And I'm coming up to my point here, the V point. So I'm just making sure those seam allowances are where they need to be. I'm taking it really slow, using my hand wheel. And I'm pivoting at that center front point. So you can see how nice this looks with those seam allowances edge stitched there. It gives you a really nice clean finish. All right, let's do our yoke back now. It's a little bit different from the yoke front because it has a seam up the center back for your keyhole opening so you can get it over your head. Okay, so you're gonna have 2 yoke back pieces and there will be a notch up the center back. So what we need to do is put these right sides together. And we are going to stitch from the bottom of the piece up to the notch only. So just this tiny little section right here. And I'm using, okay, so I need to go back to, I'm gonna leave my edge stitch foot on because you can sew, a regular seam just fine with it. So edge stitch foot is staying on because I'm gonna need it to edge stitch the back yoke. All right, so I'm gonna start stitching here, back stitch. Whoop. This lace does not like this. Okay, let's just move this a little bit forward, see if that helps. There we go. Okay, and this is where I need to stop. So I'm going to back stitch at that notch. And you can see I'm using this sort of like darker pink thread so that you guys can see what I'm doing. But obviously your thread should match your lace. Okay, so now we want to stitch the keyhole opening down. So in the instructions we say finger press just because we know how delicate lace can be with ironing. So you want to you can finger press here or you can use a press cloth and a low heat iron. But I am just going to turn my seam allowances in and pin them here because we're going to stitch these down. Okay, so turn them turn the full seam allowance in 5/8 of an inch. And now we're going to top stitch that center back keyhole opening at 1/2 inch, just to hold those seam allowances down. Just go to the bottom of the opening and then back stitch. Okay, and same thing on the other side. I'm going to start at the bottom on this side. So now we have a nicely finished keyhole opening here. Obviously, I wished my thread matched, but it's fine, it's fine. So now I'm going to grab my top back, and this is gonna look really familiar, I hope, because it's the exact same process to set the yoke into the top back as we did for the front. Okay, so you're gonna clip to that point, and then you're going to put these right sides together, stitch along that line, being very mindful of your clip pivot point, press those, grade your seam allowances, press them down, edge stitch them in place, and then we'll meet back here after you've done all those steps and talk about the shoulder seams and the side seams. All right, here is your beautiful back yoke sewn with your keyhole opening, and now we're ready to go on to our shoulder seams and the side seams. So pretty self-explanatory. You're going to put your top front right sides together with your top back. I will say you just want to be really careful about matching these seam lines right here, because you're going to get this cute little V point on your arm or your shoulder, and so you want to make sure that your seams match there. So I like to just put a pin through at that match point first, make sure they're going to match. And then continue pinning up to the neckline. Okay. And then same thing on the other side, obviously, but let's just sew this one first because I want to talk about what stitch you're going to be using. Now that we're moving on to sewing the structural seams of the garment, the side seams and the shoulder seam, we want to build a little bit of stretch into the ponte. So go to a zigzag stitch, and I'm going to go back to my regular presser foot. And now I'm going to go to a narrow zigzag. So around 1.5 wide on my stitches and about 2.5 long. Okay, so let's stitch this seam at 5/8 of an inch. Now you can see we're stitching on the lace itself. Okay, so I want to spend a little time now just talking about seam finishing for this section, because seam finishing in shears is always something that you need to consider a little bit. So because you're going to see the seam allowances through there, obviously. So one of my favorite seam finishes for shears after like a French seam. And you could probably use a French seam here if you wanted, if your ponte wasn't too thick. But I'm going to show you something a little bit simpler, which is just doing a zigzag finish. We're going to zigzag those seam allowances together and then trim really close. From the right side, it kind of gives you the appearance of a French seam. You won't be able to see the seam allowance at all. So let's go to a wider zigzag. So you can go all the way up to like 4.5 or 5. And we're going to stitch right next to our seam line, right? Close as you can. Like so. And now we're going to just trim really close to that zigzag stitching. So, just like that. And this is just a really nice, simple finish for a sheer fabric. I like that it's just not fussy, you know, which I feel like a lot of vintage techniques really excelled at. They weren't fussy. All right, so we're just going to trim really close right here. And then in terms of pressing, obviously you're going to have to press these seam allowances to one side, right? You can't press them open because we stitch them together. So you're going to press towards the back. Anytime you have seam allowances pressed together, the rule of thumb is generally you press them towards the back of the garment. So that's why I chose that. Okay, so that's your shoulder seam. See how cute that little point is going to look on your top. I'm going to repeat that on the other shoulder seam, and then I just wanted to talk briefly about the side seam. So you're going to match your notches, our side seams. Now these are, as you can see, a very curved seam because of the cut-on sleeve. And I've already pinned mine, but I just want to mention a few things. I also thought it was worth talking really quickly about this dart notch situation. So because this dart is at such an extreme angle, because it's a French dart, that means that your notch isn't going to match up exactly with where the dart is. So see how the notch is right here? If you sort of continue the line of where that notch would go, it would meet at the 5/8 of an inch seam line, okay? So I know it can be confusing. Sometimes you're matching your side seams and you think that doesn't match anything, but this is actually intended to match your dart. So, but you should be looking at the seam line always, not looking at the raw edge. So hopefully that will help you as you're matching up your seam. All right, so I am just going to sew this seam using my narrow zigzag, and then I'm going to do a few clips into this seam allowance and then just press it open. You don't have to do that seam finish that we did for the shoulder seam because it's not sheer here. Also, I just wanted to mention that you don't really need to finish this fabric because ponte just does not fray at all. So don't worry about it. Just sew your seam. Be very careful around that curve. Do a couple little clips into the curviest part of the underarm and then press it open. Okay, so I'm going to sew both my side seams, my other shoulder seam, which I haven't done yet, and then we'll come back and talk about collars. We now have what is looking like a beautiful top. So you can just put that to the side, and we're going to focus on the collar now, which is, of course, your merit badge topic. So pay special attention now, Charm Scouts. We're going to talk about all the things that are going to get you a beautifully finished collar. All right, so part of it I feel like we've already done for you, which is the drafting. So as I mentioned in the intro, or whenever that was, many chapters ago, we have drafted separate upper collar and under collar pieces. So what you want to remember is that the upper collar needs to be slightly bigger than the under collar, and that's going to play into how the pieces go together when we pin them together. Other thing to remember is that you want to interface your upper collar, but not your under collar, okay? So you can see I've already applied tricot to the upper collar pieces, but none on the under collar. The other thing I want you to remember is that you need these dots right here. See how there are dots on each end of the pattern right here? Same on the under collar. That's to remind you not to stitch past there, okay? When we sew the collar pieces together, we're gonna start at that dot, and this all plays into our clean finish technique. No facing, no binding, none of that. So that's the reason for that, and you'll see how it comes together. Okay, so first things first, we are going to open out the upper collar, the one with the interfacing, and then we're going to put these right sides together into pairs. One upper collar with one under collar, like this. So we now have 2 pairs of collars. Now we are going to start pinning, and you're gonna pin around these 3 edges. Okay, let me just focus one here in the center here. We're going to pin around these 3 edges. This is the neckline edge, the edge with the notches, and it stays open. Okay, so you can start to pin around here, but I really want to make sure that you're understanding how these pieces go together. The upper collar is a little bigger, so you need to make those edges match, okay? So the work is done in the drafting for you, but now you have to actually take the time to make those edges match, because see here, the pieces don't actually naturally match if you just place them on top of each other. You have to like physically impose your will on them and make them match at the edges. And that means it's going to like creep up a little bit here, but that's what we want, okay? Because this is what is going to make our collar look really beautiful by helping the seam line roll to the underside of the collar. All right, so I'm just gonna fill in some pins along here. Okay, so now we're gonna stitch around those 3 edges, and just a couple things I wanna mention. Start stitching, and I have my circles on this side, so I'll probably stitch from this side. So start stitching at your circle and end at your other circle. And also, I'm gonna do a little trick around the corners. I know there are a lot, if you read Threads magazine, like I do, you know there are a million tips for getting crisp corners. This is one of my favorites, which is to do one little diagonal stitch across the corner right here at the pivot point. So I'm gonna talk about that while I'm stitching. Okay, so now we're going to stitch around our collar, starting at that circle mark. Now, make sure that you are on a straight stitch for this, because we are not on a seam line or, you know, a construction seam anymore. That needs to stretch. Now we're on the collar, which does not need to stretch, so you can use your straight stitch. Starting at your circle, back stitching. And now as I approach this first corner, I just want to talk about this little trick. So as you get close to your 5/8 of an inch mark here, once you're ready to pivot, go kind of like on a diagonal here and take just one stitch with your hand wheel and then pivot. And that helps us get a crisper corner. I will tell you that it is not that easy to get a super crisp corner in Ponte. We're gonna do our best, but when I think of crisp shirt corners on a collar, I would really think of like a cotton lawn or an Oxford shirting or something like that. Ponte kind of doesn't work with you that well on those corners. So we're just doing this little extra trick to try to help out with that. And make sure that your raw edges stay together. They can kind of try to roll away from each other. All right, so let's do this little pivot trick again. So I'm getting close to 5/8 here because I have this line on my machine that helpfully tells me. I'm going to take one stitch on the diagonal right here, and then I'm going to complete my pivot. And then I am going to only go to 5/8 of an inch here, or my circle mark, and then backstitch. Okay, so let's talk about braiding and clipping and trimming and all of that. Okay, so first we're going to grade the under collar, so the side that is not interfaced. This one should be the shorter seam allowance. So you can trim this down to about 1/8 of an inch all the way around. Okay, so you're gonna keep going with that. And then the upper collar, or the one that is interfaced, should be about double that, so 1/4 inch. Okay, so you're gonna continue that. And then we're going to trim away in each corner. So really just cut on the diagonal like this. I like to trim away like from each corner like that. I know some people just cut right across, but I like to get in there and cut away from the corner. All right, I'm gonna keep trimming. And then we will talk about turning this right side out. Okay, just going back into those corners, just trimming up a little bit more. Now we can turn the collar right side out. So I like to just put my fingernail into the corner there and kind of use it as a little pressing aid, a point turner to turn my corner right side out. Same thing on the other, I just put my fingernail in there and then turn it right side out. And now you can use a pin. Be very gentle here, okay? You don't want to go crazy because you can start to pull your threads and the little seam allowances to the right side. So you just want to get as crisp a corner as possible right there. I'm gonna do the same thing on the other side. So you just kind of use the pin to just like kind of scoop into that corner and pull the seam allowance out rather than pushing it out from the inside. Okay, so next step, which is I think is one of the most important steps to getting a really nicely finished collar, is understitching. So I know we think of understitching around like necklines and waistbands and stuff like that, but I really like to use it on collars too, because see this edge right here that is just looking a hot mess, right? And you can just try to press it and make it do what you want it to do, or we can understitch and really get a beautiful crisp edge right there. So I am going to go over to the machine. What we're gonna do is open it out like this, and we're gonna understitch as far as we can from this corner. You're not gonna be able to get all the way to this corner, but as far as you can to this corner, and then as far as you can towards this corner, we're going to understitch. All right, so that means we are going to open this out like so. We're gonna be making sure that our seam allowances are situated towards the under collar, okay? Because we don't want our understitching to show on the upper collar. We are understitching the under collar. All right, so with a collar, I find it helpful to kind of go inside, like kind of form a little, like, I guess like a petal shape like this, and then we're just kind of working from within All right, so I'm going to be stitching right next to the seam line, you know, 1/16 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch. We are stitching on the under collar side, but our seam allowances are positioned towards the under collar, so I'm stitching through the under collar and both seam allowances. Now, one of the most important things about understitching, one of the most important steps you can take is to use your hands to spread the two pieces apart like this, so you get a nice taut seam line right here. So, I mean, you don't have to stretch it, you don't want to see strain, but you want it to be as smooth as possible. You're creating this nice flat surface. Okay, and here now that little petal shape is starting to form again. And just go as far as you can. You're not going to be able to go all the way to the corner, unfortunately. But go as far as you can. All right, everyone, so we have two sides of this collar finished, and remember, you've turned in and pressed in the upper collar or the interfaced collar, and then the other one is just still out open. Okay, so one thing I want to draw your attention to on the front yoke is that there is a half notch here at center front, which just means you need to do a little snip there to find the center front of your blouse. Okay, so if you're missing that, go back and make sure you find it. You can also, you know, just fold your center front yoke in half like that, and then just do a little snip at the center front at the fold. Okay, so now we're going to apply our collar pieces to our blouse. All right, so you're gonna start at center front, and what we're going to do is we're only working with the under collar side. All right, so at my center front notch, I am matching the center front of the collar. I'm putting a pin here, and I'm leaving the folded edge totally free. All right, and your other match points are the shoulder seam. So you can match this notch to the shoulder seam like that. And then you can put a few pins in between here. And then there's another notch in the back. So match those notches. And then these two finished edges should be flush. They should just meet like this. All right, so that's one side of the collar pinned on. I would definitely recommend using a lot of pins on this step. Okay, so there's one side. Now let's grab the other side of the collar, and the placement here at center front is really important. So it's almost like these two seam allowances need to overlap, right? Because we want these two sides of the collar to be like kissing each other at center front. So that means the seam allowances need to almost cross over each other. Now, I will tell you a little trick we're gonna do at the end too for hand finishing is just to put a little hand stitch between those two sides to hold them together. So if they're not perfect, don't fret too much, because we will rectify that with hand stitching. Okay, let's go to our other match points. There's my shoulder seam. Fill in that space here. And you might be able to guess how this collar is coming together. What we're going to do is machine stitch these two pieces together with the folded in seam allowance totally free, so not caught in your stitching. And then we'll be able to sandwich the seam allowances between the collar layers for a completely clean finish. So very exciting. I'm just gonna go back and double check what's going on at my center front here and just put another pin. Like I said, you can just like go crazy here with pins. All right, so now I'm gonna start stitching. I'm on a straight stitch. I'm starting at center back. And just stitch all the way around at 5/8 of an inch, keeping that folded under seam allowance free. To the end here, and I just want to make sure that this seam allowance stays folded under. So I'm just going to push it there. There we go, and back stitch. Okay, so very exciting. I love this color combo going on here. So now you can see I'm going to need to turn in my seam allowances, and it's very important that we clip all the way on the lace to center front, right? So that we can turn in the seam allowances completely between the layers like this. Now I think I'm getting really excited and skipping a trimming step right here, now that I'm thinking back to the instructions. So I do want to mention that it's a great idea to trim down some seam allowances inside the collar. So what I would recommend is actually trimming down these two seam allowances, the yoke and the under collar, right? So let's go ahead and do that together. As tempting as it is to just continue, I would say you could just trim those down together by about half. Just trim those away. Same thing on the other side. So again, just the lace and the under collar side of the collar. Okay, so you can see how many pins I've used here to hold the layers in place, and now I'm going to hand stitch. And I did want to mention too, you can see how the two layers are coming apart at center front. So what you're going to do there is just do a little hand stitch through both. Do a couple little running stitches right on top of each other just to tack them together, so they'll stay together nice and perfect like that, okay? But for the rest of it, we're going to do a slip stitch through the layers. Pretty sure you guys know how to do a slip stitch, but we are going to come up through the under layer, and then in just one continuous line of stitching here, go right through the fold of the upper collar like that. And just continue around like this. Go all the way around the collar, do that tack at center front. And then we're gonna have this beautiful clean finish on your neckline. So I was so excited when we came up with this method because a facing wouldn't have really worked here, right? Because it would show through the lace. And the other thing I was considering was like a bias strip facing, but then that would have added so much bulk to this neckline, especially because Ponte tends to get really, really bulky when you have several layers of it. So I was thinking, okay, that's going to be many layers of Ponte if we have to fold in a bias binding on the inside. So this I just thought was a really elegant sort of solution to how we're going to finish this lovely lace yoke. All right, so we're going to keep stitching all the way around, and take your time. Hopefully you have a good TV show to watch while you're doing this. And then when we come back, the next thing we're going to talk about is your hems, which are all going to be machine stitched. So you're getting really close to finishing this blouse. Okay, so I have finished stitching my collar, and you can see it looks really cute. I will say you can spend a little bit of time just pressing it from the outside, just kind of rolling the collar in. But you can see it looks really cute on this lace yoke. Now, I want to talk next about hems, all right? I'm just going to briefly go over this because I know you guys know how to do this. But what we've done here, it's exactly the same as we did for Barbie's, Skipper if you were doing the dress, and Hepburn. So just going to turn your, I'm working on the bottom of the top now, so you're just going to turn that lower hem up 5/8 of an inch. And then we're going to take it over to the machine. So I just pressed it all the way around. And then we're going to take it to the machine, and you're going to go to your narrow zigzag, so 1.5 wide by about 2.5 long. And we're going to top stitch at 1/2 inch all the way around. Back stitch when you meet where your stitching started. I'm just going to trim away all these threads, of course. All right, so let's take a look at this hem. So I really love this finish. I feel like it just blends in really nicely. And you can also just give it a final press here too, which will help the stitches just kind of like sink in there. Okay, so easy. You're going to repeat that on your sleeves, okay? So just press in 5/8 of an inch and then top stitch all the way around using that narrow zigzag at 1/2 inch. Final thing on your Gardner top is to do your hook and eye at the center back neckline to close your keyhole. All right, so you guys know I hate sewing hooks and eyes, so I'm not going to actually show this today, but I'm going to show you where it goes. All right, so the hook side can go on the inside and sew it directly to the lace. It's a little finicky to sew a hook and eye to lace, but it's really the best solution. We thought about buttons and loops and all that, but it's really just a nice, simple finish here. So sew it to the inside of the neckline, just to the lace there. And then on the other side, you're going to sew this corresponding, so tiny, this corresponding eye over here so that they just meet and close your neckline just like that. And then you have this really pretty little keyhole in the back. So that's it. I feel like this top comes together pretty quickly and it gives such a beautiful effect with the lace yoke. Okay, so with all of your finishing work done, your Gardner top is done and complete. So I hope you love this project. I feel like it comes together really quickly and it's so satisfying being able to pair different fabrics together, and it really gives you this gorgeous vintage look with the lace yoke. So have fun playing around with different fabrics and different pairings, and don't feel like you need to, match your, like the blouse I'm wearing, the same tone, lace and ponte. Have fun with doing different tones, or even doing super contrasting colors would be really fun. And definitely check out some fishnet and polka dots in the tulle. I'm all about that. So I hope you guys really like this project. I can't wait to see what you make. I know that there's going to be someone sewing this up so fast, and we'll get to see a new version really soon. So I can't wait to see what you sew. Don't forget to tag me and use the hashtag Gardner Top.
So I hope you all have loved this project, and thank you so much for being patrons, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.